The lights were warm on my face, the hum of the studio settling into the background like it always did. Today was no different, at least to anyone watching. I glanced across the set where Emma was getting her makeup touched up, the crew buzzing around her like usual. To them, she was still the golden girl of morning TV, a voice of reason and charm that brightened every viewer's morning. To me, she was a liar. I shifted in my chair, the fake smile I wore now second nature. Funny how easy it was to hide what was festering beneath the surface when you've been playing the perfect husband for so long. We had built this show together, me and her. Good Morning, New York had become our life, our brand, our everything. But Emma, she'd gone and built something else on the side. It wasn't long ago that I'd stumbled onto it. A few misplaced texts, a phone call I wasn't supposed to overhear, and suddenly, Matt, the damn music producer we'd hired 6 months ago, was no longer just a coworker. The laugh they shared that afternoon, the way she touched his arm when she thought no one was looking. It all made sense now. But I wasn't the type to explode in a fit of rage. No, I was too calculated for that. I'd spent my whole life learning to play it cool, keeping my emotions in check even when everything was falling apart. So, instead of confronting her in private, where she could spin her lies and shed those crocodile tears, I decided to expose her in the one place she couldn't hide. On air, live, I could hear the director counting us down. 3, 2, 1. The familiar jingle of our show intro played, and I turned to the camera, flashing my usual confident smile. Good morning, New York. I'm John, and you know who this is, our one and only Emma. I nodded toward her, watching as she gave that practiced wave, her glossy smile reflecting under the studio lights. Everything seemed perfect, just like she wanted it to be. But today, perfection was going to unravel. We've got something special lined up for you today, I continued, my voice smooth, practiced. We're launching a new segment, something we're calling Relationship Secrets. I felt Emma's eyes on me, surprised, but she didn't say a word. I hadn't briefed her on this. That was part of the plan. You know, I said, leaning back in my chair like this was all a casual chat, relationships are complicated. Even the strongest ones, the ones that seem rock solid from the outside, they all have their cracks, don't they? My tone was light and playful. The audience wouldn't know what was coming, not yet. But Emma shifted in her seat, the slightest frown crossing her face. So, today we're going to dive deep into those little secrets that every couple keeps. What do you think, Emma? Ready to spill some truths? Her smile faltered for a second. Sure, sounds interesting, she replied, trying to regain control. She didn't know yet. She didn't know how deep this was going to cut. Let's start with something simple, I said, keeping the mood upbeat. Do you think everyone deserves a second chance, no matter what they've done? Emma blinked, clearly not expecting such a loaded question. Well, I suppose that depends on the situation, she answered, her voice cautious. I think trust is important. Once it's broken, it's hard to rebuild. But, yeah, everyone deserves a second chance if they're truly sorry. I smiled, leaning forward just slightly. Interesting. So, what about honesty? In your opinion, is it ever okay to lie to the person you love? She hesitated, and I could see her eyes flick toward the camera, calculating her response. I think white lies are okay. Sometimes, to protect someone's feelings. I chuckled softly. Protecting feelings, huh? I guess it depends on the lie. I paused, letting my words hang in the air, waiting for the tension to settle in. What if the lie was something bigger? Like, say, hiding an affair? Her face went pale. She didn't expect that, and neither did the audience. For a moment, the air in the studio seemed to freeze. Emma's smile, the one that had carried her through hundreds of interviews and countless segments, faltered. She quickly tried to recover, but I could see it, the panic behind her eyes. An affair? She repeated, laughing nervously. That's a bit extreme, don't you think? I shrugged, keeping my face neutral. Not really. Happens more often than people think. Sometimes right under their nose. My words were casual, but the meaning hit hard. I let the silence stretch, the weight of it pressing down on her. She glanced at the camera, then back at me, probably trying to figure out how far I was willing to take this. She had no idea. Well, she started, her voice unsteady, I think it's important to be honest. But, it's also important not to jump to conclusions. A deflection. Classic Emma. I almost admired how quickly she tried to dance around the subject. But not this time. That's true, I said, leaning back in my chair, my gaze never leaving hers. But sometimes, the truth is already there. It's just a matter of whether or not you're ready to face it. Emma shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I knew her tells. She crossed her legs and fidgeted with the bracelet on her wrist, a nervous habit she'd had for as long as I could remember. I could almost hear the gears in her head turning, trying to figure out how to escape the corner I'd backed her into. Look, she said, her voice firmer now, relationships are complicated. People make mistakes. It's about forgiveness and moving forward. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You're right, people do make mistakes, but some mistakes, well, they're harder to forgive, especially when the person making them pretends everything's fine. She didn't respond right away. The silence stretched longer this time, and I could feel the tension in the room rising. The audience, the crew, everyone watching, they could sense it. The perfect, polished image of Emma was starting to crack. Are we still talking hypothetically here, John? She asked, her voice tight. I paused, letting her question hang in the air for a moment, savoring the discomfort I was creating. That depends. Are we? Her eyes flicked to the camera again, her face betraying her growing anxiety. She wasn't sure where this was going, but she could feel the ground slipping from beneath her. I could see the producer in the corner, shifting uneasily. He probably didn't want to stop the segment. It was gold for ratings, but he also didn't know how far I planned to take this. That made two of us. I just think, I said slowly, leaning forward, that sometimes we convince ourselves we can get away with anything. That the truth will stay hidden. But the truth has a way of coming out, doesn't it? She swallowed, the color draining from her face. John, I think we should. Secrets have a way of destroying everything we've worked for, I continued, cutting her off. They ruin relationships, careers. They ruin trust. And once that's gone, it's hard to get back. Emma's breathing had quickened, and her smile was now completely gone. I don't know what you're getting at, but, don't you? I interrupted, my voice low but steady. Because I think you do. For a moment, it felt like the entire studio was holding its breath. The cameras were still rolling, the audience still glued to their screens, but here, in this moment, it was just me and her. There was no escape now, no charming smile that could cover this. I could see it in her eyes, the fear. She knew I had her cornered. Emma shifted in her seat, opening her mouth as if to say something, then closing it again. I knew she was searching for a way out. For the right words that would make all of this disappear. But there weren't any. I leaned back in my chair, the tension almost palpable between us now. The audience was riveted, and the crew was stunned into silence. Everyone was waiting for what would come next. John, Emma finally said, her voice softer now, pleading almost. I think we need to stop this. Whatever point you're trying to make. I raised an eyebrow, pretending not to understand. What point is that, Emma? Her eyes flashed with frustration. You know exactly what I mean. I smiled again, this time colder, sharper. I'm just talking about relationships. Secrets. Trust. You're the one acting like there's something more going on here. She glared at me, her composure slipping further by the second. This isn't the place for personal attacks. I'm not attacking anyone, I said, keeping my voice even. Just discussing the reality of trust and betrayal. It's a topic we've all experienced, don't you think? She didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned to the camera, as if appealing to the audience, hoping to steer the conversation back to safer ground. Trust is important, she said, her voice a little shakier than before. But we should also be careful not to let assumptions destroy relationships. I didn't let her off the hook that easily. Sometimes it's not assumptions. Sometimes it's facts. Facts that can't be ignored. Her hands tightened into fists, and for a moment, I thought she might walk off set. But she didn't. She couldn't. Not without looking guilty. I leaned in again, my voice quiet, but firm enough for everyone to hear. The truth has a funny way of coming out, Emma. No matter how well you try to hide it. She blinked rapidly, her composure crumbling. I could see her trying to hold on, trying to find a way to keep the facade intact. But the damage was done. The cracks were there for everyone to see now. Before she could respond, I stood up, removed my mic, and placed it on the table. The studio was dead silent. The crew frozen as they watched the scene unfold. I think we're done here, I said, looking at her one last time before turning to leave the set. Good luck with the show. And just like that, I walked off, leaving Emma to face the fallout. The truth was out, and there was no putting it back. I stepped outside the studio into the crisp morning air, my head still buzzing from what had just happened. The show would go on without me for now, the crew scrambling to cut to commercial or figure out damage control. But the damage had been done. Emma's perfect world was already crumbling, and I had lit the fuse in front of millions. I stood in the alley behind the building, letting the quiet settle around me. It was a strange feeling, like I was watching my own life unravel in slow motion. The woman I had trusted, the woman I had built everything with, had betrayed me in the most humiliating way. And now, she'd have to face the world knowing that I wasn't the only one who knew. I glanced back at the studio entrance. I could already imagine the chaos inside. Emma, desperately trying to keep it together, threw her mic off and stormed backstage. Her heart must have been racing. I hoped it was. She deserved every bit of panic that was clawing at her now. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through my messages, wondering if there were any repercussions yet. As if on cue, the screen lit up, dozens of notifications. Texts from friends, colleagues, and strangers alike flooded in, all asking the same thing: what the hell just happened? My phone buzzed with another incoming message. This time it was from Alex, one of our show's producers. I could practically hear the tension in his voice through the words. "Call me ASAP. What the hell did you just do?" I ignored it, pocketing the phone and starting to walk. I didn't care about the show anymore. I didn't care about the fallout that Emma would have to deal with. This wasn't about keeping things professional or preserving our brand. This was about making sure she knew that I wasn't the idiot she thought I was. I'd exposed her on live TV, and the public would devour it. Scandal always sells, and soon enough, Emma's polished reputation would be dragged through the mud. Headlines were already probably being written, the gossip mill spinning into overdrive. Morning show meltdown. TV host's marriage explodes on air. Part of me felt satisfaction, knowing that this would be the first step in destroying the lie she'd been living. But another part of me felt empty. I had imagined this moment for weeks. Ever since I found out about her and Matt, I had fantasized about the look on her face when she realized her game was over. And yet, standing there now, in the cool morning air, all I could think was how hollow it felt. It wasn't over. Not yet. I knew Emma wouldn't just roll over. She'd fight back, try to salvage what she could from the wreckage. Maybe she'd play the victim, spin some sob story about how I blindsided her, how the stress of the job or our relationship pushed her into Matt's arms. She'd have some excuse. She always did. I wasn't interested in excuses. I wanted her to face the consequences. And I knew exactly where to find her next. Without a second thought, I headed toward the parking lot. I had no intention of going back to the studio that day, or ever again. My mind was already racing ahead, thinking about the next step. It wasn't enough to humiliate her on air. I needed more. I needed to make sure that Matt, too, paid for his part in all of this. As I got in the car, my phone buzzed again, this time with a call. It was Alex. I let it ring, staring at the screen until the call went to voicemail. Then I turned on the ignition and drove off, leaving the chaos of the morning show behind. I had a meeting to get to, one that would set everything in motion. The upscale coffee shop Matt always went to was just a few blocks from the studio. He liked the quiet, the privacy. A place where he could conduct his business away from prying eyes. Unfortunately for him, I knew about all his little habits. I parked outside and waited. My fingers tapped nervously on the steering wheel as I checked the time. He'd show up soon. He always came here after our morning tapings. Emma would probably try to reach him first, tell him what had happened. But it wouldn't matter. Once I had him, there'd be no more secrets. Sure enough, 15 minutes later, Matt pulled up in his black sedan, parking just a few spaces down from me. He didn't notice me as he stepped out of his car, adjusting his jacket and heading toward the entrance. The man looked oblivious, like nothing could touch him. I smiled to myself. He had no idea what was coming. I waited a beat, then got out of the car and followed him inside. The place was quiet, with only a few customers sitting at their tables, laptops open, sipping on overpriced lattes. Matt had already ordered and was waiting at the counter when I approached him. "Matt," he turned, surprised to hear my voice. "John, hey, man, what are you doing here?" I didn't bother with pleasantries. I just stared at him, my expression cold. His smile faltered, his eyes narrowing slightly as he tried to gauge the situation. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady, but with enough weight to let him know this wasn't a casual conversation. Matt shifted awkwardly, glancing around the cafe. Sure, what's up? Not here, I said. Outside. I didn't give him a chance to argue. I turned and walked toward the door, and after a moment's hesitation, he followed me out. Once we were outside, I led him to a quiet corner by the parking lot, away from the windows where anyone could see us. He was nervous now. I could tell. Good. What's this about? He asked, trying to sound casual but failing. I took a step closer to him, my eyes locking on his. I know about you and Emma. His face went pale instantly. What? Don't play dumb, I said, cutting him off. I know everything. Matt swallowed hard, his eyes darting around like he was looking for an escape. There wasn't one. Not this time. John, you think you can just mess around behind my back and get away with it? I hissed, my voice low but deadly. You think no one would notice? He stammered, trying to find the right words. It's not what you think. I didn't mean for this to happen. I laughed, the sound bitter. Of course not. It's never what I think, is it? You just happened to fall into bed with my wife by accident, right? Matt was shaking now, his hands trembling as he tried to explain. Look, man, I'm sorry. I really am. It was a mistake. It didn't mean anything. Didn't mean anything? I stepped closer, my voice cold. Well, it means something now. I just ruined her career on live TV. And you're next. Matt's face crumpled as if the weight of my words hit him like a punch to the gut. I watched him for a moment, letting the tension simmer between us. There was no need to rush, I wanted him to feel it. The dread, the fear. John, please, he stammered. There has to be a way to fix this. I didn't mean to hurt you. It just happened. Emma, don't say her name, I cut him off, my voice sharp. You don't get to talk about her like you're some kind of victim here. You think she didn't know what she was doing? He flinched at my words, swallowing hard. His eyes darted around as if he was searching for a way out of this nightmare. But there wasn't one. Not anymore. You made your choices, Matt. Both of you did, and now you're going to face the consequences. His breathing was heavy, ragged. I could see the panic settling in, the realization that I wasn't bluffing. He probably thought I'd just explode in a fit of rage and that would be it. But I wasn't interested in screaming matches or fistfights. That would be too easy for him. I can fix this, Matt pleaded. I'll talk to Emma. I'll make things right. Just give me a chance. I leaned back, crossing my arms as I watched him squirm. Fix it? I said slowly, savoring the irony. This isn't something you can fix. But maybe, just maybe, you can minimize the damage. He blinked, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. What do you mean? I want you to quit. Leave the studio. Walk away, quietly. His face twisted in confusion. Quit? The show? That's right, I said calmly. You're done working with Emma. You're done with the show. Pack your things, and I never want to see your face again. You don't even get to say goodbye. He looked like I just slapped him across the face. You can't be serious. My whole career is nothing compared to what I could do to you, I interrupted, my voice low and menacing. If you think this is bad, just imagine what happens if I go public with everything. You're lucky I'm giving you an out. Take it. Matt stood there, stunned, clearly grappling with the reality of the situation. I could see the gears turning in his head. He knew I had him cornered, but he didn't want to admit it. Not yet. I'll give you until the end of the day to make your decision, I said, turning to leave. But know this, if you don't quit, I'll burn everything down. Your career, Emma's, everything. And I'll make sure you both lose everything you've built. With that, I left him standing there, shell-shocked, and walked back to my car. I didn't need to hear his response right now. I knew what he'd decide. People like Matt always folded when the stakes got too high. The drive home was quiet, my mind replaying the scene over and over. This wasn't over yet, but I was setting the pieces in place. I had just given him a lifeline, but if he thought he could outsmart me, he was in for a rude awakening. This was just the beginning of his fall. And as for Emma, her reckoning would come soon enough. By the time I got home, the shock of what I'd done was starting to wear off, replaced by an eerie calm. My house felt strange now, almost foreign. The living room where we'd spent countless evenings together seemed like a set piece, part of a life that no longer existed. I couldn't help but notice how quiet it was. No sounds of Emma bustling in the kitchen, no music playing softly from the speakers like usual. Just silence. I tossed my keys on the counter and checked my phone again. Nothing from Emma. She was probably still at the studio, dealing with the aftermath of my public revelation. I imagined the frantic calls she must be making, the excuses she'd be coming up with to explain away what had just happened on live television. But deep down, she had to know it was over. There was no hiding from this. No salvaging what we once had. I grabbed a beer from the fridge and sat down on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. The local news hadn't picked up the story yet, but it was only a matter of time before the media got wind of it. Mourning the show hosts having a public meltdown over an affair? That was tabloid gold. I flicked through the channels, not really paying attention to anything until my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a text, it was a call. The screen lit up with Emma's name. For a moment, I just stared at it, letting it ring. I wasn't ready to hear her voice yet, not after everything. But after a few more rings, I swiped to answer. John. Her voice was shaky, barely holding it together. We need to talk. I didn't say anything right away. I wanted her to sit with that silence, to feel the weight of her actions hanging between us. John, please, she continued, her voice cracking. I don't know what you were thinking. Doing that on air, humiliating me like that. How could you? How could I? I finally said, my tone cold. You're really asking me that after what you've been doing behind my back for months? There was a pause, a brief moment of silence on her end as she tried to gather herself. I made a mistake, okay? I admit it, but this is beyond cruel, John. You didn't have to do it like that. Didn't I? I shot back. You didn't give me a choice, Emma. You lied to me. You lied to everyone, and now you're dealing with the fallout. She was quiet for a moment, her breath shaky. I didn't want it to be like this, she said softly. I didn't want to hurt you. Well, congratulations, I said bitterly. You did. There was another long pause. I could hear her struggling to find the right words, but there were no words that could undo what had been done. Is this it, then? She finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Are we done? I took a deep breath, closing my eyes. The truth was, I didn't know the answer to that question yet. I didn't know what I wanted anymore. All I knew was that the trust between us was shattered, and I didn't see a way to put it back together. We'll figure it out, I said, my voice cold and detached. But right now, I need space. She didn't argue, didn't beg. Maybe she knew that nothing she said would change the way I felt at that moment. The call ended with a quiet, okay. I sat there on the couch, staring at the blank TV screen. The house felt emptier than ever, like the life we'd built together had already been packed away and forgotten. And maybe it had. The days after the on-air confrontation were a blur of headlines and phone calls. It seemed like every media outlet had caught wind of the scandal, and by the end of the week, we were the top story in every tabloid. Morning show meltdown, co-host's affair exposed live. The headlines blared, complete with photos of me and Emma side by side, expressions frozen in shock. Emma's PR team scrambled to get ahead of the story, releasing statements about personal issues and a temporary leave of absence. But everyone knew what had happened. There was no undoing it, no sweeping this under the rug. I'd stayed away from the studio, taking time off to clear my head. The producers had called me several times, offering support, but I could tell they were more concerned about the show than about me. We'll figure out a way forward, they said. But I wasn't so sure. I didn't even know if I wanted to go back. As for Emma, she'd gone dark. No calls, no messages. I could imagine her holed up in her apartment, trying to figure out how to salvage her career. I didn't care. After everything she'd done, the only satisfaction I took from this was knowing that Matt had resigned quietly as I'd asked. One less face to deal with. The quiet in my house was starting to become unbearable. I had thought I'd enjoy the space, the time to think, but instead, it felt like a constant reminder of what was gone. The emptiness that used to be filled with Emma's laughter, her voice, now there was nothing. One night, a week after the broadcast, I found myself staring at my phone, scrolling through news articles about us. The comments were brutal. Everyone had an opinion about what had gone down, and the public wasn't being kind to Emma. She got what was coming, one commenter wrote. No sympathy for cheaters. Another post went on about how John was right to expose her like that. It didn't feel good, not in the way I thought it would. Instead of satisfaction, there was just a hollow feeling, like I had torn everything down and now there was nothing left. Was this the revenge I had planned? Was this what I really wanted? As I sat there, the doorbell rang, breaking my thoughts. I hesitated before answering, unsure who it could be. When I opened the door, I was surprised to see Emma standing there, looking pale and tired, a far cry from the polished image she usually presented. "We need to talk," she said softly, her eyes pleading. "Please." I stepped aside, letting her in. The tension between us was palpable, but I didn't feel anger anymore. I was just tired. Emma stood in the middle of the living room, looking around as if she barely recognized the place anymore. "I didn't want to do this over the phone," she said. "I thought, after everything, you deserved a face-to-face conversation." I crossed my arms, leaning against the wall. "What is there to talk about, Emma? You lied. You cheated. What's left to say?" She winced at my words but didn't try to defend herself. "I know I hurt you. I know I've ruined everything." Her voice trembled, and for a moment, I saw the woman I had once loved, vulnerable and afraid. I need you to know that I never meant for it to get this far. Matt, it was a mistake. A stupid, selfish mistake. Yeah, I got that," I said coldly. "But the damage is done." She swallowed hard, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm sorry, John. I really am. If I could take it back, I would." I stared at her, unsure what to say. Apologies didn't change the fact that my trust was shattered. "Sorry isn't enough," I said finally. "I don't know if anything is enough." Emma nodded, wiping at her eyes. "I know, but I had to try. I had to at least tell you how much I regret it." For a moment, we stood there in silence, the weight of everything pressing down on us. I could see that she was broken, that she knew there was no going back to how things used to be. But I also knew that I didn't hate her, not in the way I thought I would. "I need time," I said quietly, "to figure out where we go from here." Emma nodded again, her shoulders sagging in defeat. "I understand." She turned to leave, pausing at the door. "If you ever want to talk, I'll be here. I know I don't deserve it, but I'll wait." As she left, I felt a strange sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted. The confrontation I had been dreading was over, and now I could start to rebuild. Whether that meant with her or without her, I didn't know yet. The next few days passed in a haze of introspection. I kept replaying Emma's words in my head, her apology, her regret, and I wondered if it was enough. Could I forgive her? Could we ever go back to being the couple we once were? The producers had reached out again, asking when I'd be ready to come back. I hadn't given them an answer yet. Part of me didn't want to go back at all. The show had been my life for so long, but now it felt tainted, like it represented everything I had lost. But walking away from it completely? That was another kind of loss I wasn't sure I was ready to face. On a Saturday morning, I found myself standing in front of the studio, looking at the entrance as if it were the gateway to another life. I hadn't stepped foot inside since the day of the on-air reveal, and now I was filled with uncertainty. I wasn't sure if I could do it, if I could sit next to Emma on camera again, knowing what had happened. Knowing that our relationship had been shattered beyond repair. I hesitated for a moment before turning away. I wasn't ready yet. As I walked back to my car, I felt my phone buzz in my pocket. It was a message from Emma. "Let me know when you're ready to talk." I didn't respond. Not yet. I needed more time to decide what I really wanted. What kind of future I was willing to build, whether it was alone or with her. Driving home, I felt a strange mix of sadness and resolve. I had spent so long planning my revenge, imagining how I would expose Emma and make her suffer for what she had done. But now that it had all played out, I realized it hadn't brought me the satisfaction I thought it would. The anger had dissipated, leaving behind a hollow space. Maybe it wasn't about revenge anymore. Maybe it was about finding a way forward, even if that path wasn't clear yet. One thing was certain, I couldn't stay in this limbo forever. A decision would have to be made, and soon. And when it was, I knew there would be no turning back. 2 weeks later, I was standing in front of the studio again. This time, I wasn't hesitating. I'd made my decision. I walked through the familiar doors, past the security guards, and into the hallway that led to our dressing rooms. It felt surreal to be back after everything, but it also felt like closure was within reach. Today wasn't just another show. Today was my final broadcast. The producers had convinced me to come back for one more appearance, to give the audience some sense of closure after the drama that had unfolded on air. They wanted to keep it light, steer away from any mention of the scandal, and offer a gracious goodbye to the viewers. I agreed, but on my own terms. When I stepped into the dressing room, Emma was already there, sitting in front of the mirror. She glanced up at me, her eyes red and tired, but there was no anger or defensiveness in them. Just exhaustion. "John," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded at her but didn't speak. There wasn't much left to say. We both knew this was the end. As I got ready, slipping into the familiar routine of makeup and prep, I could feel the tension hanging in the air. Emma was fidgeting, clearly uncomfortable with the silence between us. But I wasn't here to make her feel better. I was here to say goodbye. When the show started, everything felt strangely normal. The cameras were in place, the crew was bustling around, and the usual pre-show chatter filled the studio. For a moment, it was like nothing had changed, like the past month hadn't happened. But as soon as the cameras started rolling, I could feel the weight of it all. The audience didn't know this would be my last time on the show. They were expecting the usual banter, the light-hearted jokes. They had no idea what was coming. Halfway through the broadcast, I glanced at Emma, who was reading the teleprompter with a forced smile. The producers had kept her role minimal today, clearly not wanting to risk any emotional outbursts. They had no idea what I had planned. "Before we wrap up," I said, turning to the camera, "I just want to take a moment to thank all of you. For the past 5 years, this show has been my life. I've had the privilege of connecting with all of you every morning, and it's been an incredible journey." Emma shifted uncomfortably in her seat, sensing that something was off. The producers, watching from the control room, probably did too. "But today is my last show," I continued. "I've made the decision to step away and move on to other things. I want to thank my co-host, Emma, for the time we've shared on air. It's been quite a ride, hasn't it?" I saw her eyes widen, but she kept her composure. She had no choice. "I've learned a lot about myself during this time," I said, my voice steady. "And one thing I've learned is that sometimes, the truth comes out in ways you don't expect. Sometimes, the people you think you know turn out to be strangers." The audience was silent. Emma stared at me, her face pale. "I want to leave you all with this thought," I said, leaning forward slightly. "Honesty is the foundation of any relationship, whether it's personal or professional. And when that honesty is broken, it's not just the relationship that suffers. It's everything." The silence in the studio was deafening. I could feel Emma's eyes on me, but I didn't look at her. This was my moment. "And with that," I said, standing up, "I'm signing off. Thank you, everyone, for the memories." I walked off the set without looking back. The producers rushed to cut to commercial, their voices frantic in my earpiece, but I didn't care. I had said what I needed to say. It was done. In the weeks that followed, I felt a strange sense of freedom. The weight of the show, of my life with Emma, had lifted. I hadn't spoken to her since that final broadcast, and I had no intention of reaching out. There was nothing left between us. I spent my days in quiet reflection, trying to figure out what came next. For years, my life had been defined by the show, by the routine of being in front of the camera, but now I had the chance to rediscover who I was outside of that world. One afternoon, as I sat on my back porch with a cup of coffee, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an article, one of many that had been written about our fallout. "Morning show shakeup, John leaves, Emma struggles to rebuild." I skimmed through it, not particularly interested in the details. Emma had been trying to salvage her career, but the damage had been done. Her image was tarnished, and the network wasn't sure if they wanted to keep her on as the sole host. There were rumors that they might bring in someone new to replace her. Part of me felt bad for her. But it wasn't my problem anymore. She had made her choices. I wasn't interested in the gossip or the headlines. What mattered to me now was figuring out what I wanted for myself. The anger that had driven me to expose Emma had faded, replaced by a sense of closure. I had taken control of the situation and made my stand, and now it was time to move forward. A few days later, I got a call from an old friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. He was starting a new project, a documentary series. And he wanted me to be part of it. It wasn't a morning show, but it was a chance to get back in front of the camera, to do something different. As we talked, I felt a spark of excitement that I hadn't felt in a long time. This was an opportunity to reinvent myself, to step out of the shadow of the past and into something new. I wasn't sure if I was ready, but I was willing to try. After the call ended, I sat back and stared out at the horizon. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was mine to walk. Emma would find her own way, whatever that might be. But as for me, I was ready to move on. Ready to leave the past behind and embrace whatever came next. I didn't know where this new path would lead, but I knew one thing for sure: I was free. Weeks turned into months, and the chaos of the scandal began to fade. I settled into my new project, the documentary series, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. The pace was different, slower, and more thoughtful. It was a welcome change from the daily grind of morning television. I was learning to live again, without the constant scrutiny of the public eye. The show wasn't about me anymore. I wasn't the face of a broadcast that relied on my charisma to stay afloat. I was just one part of a larger team, and I liked it that way. The project was going well, and I found a renewed passion for storytelling, one that wasn't tied to the superficial world of ratings and celebrity gossip. But, as it turns out, the past has a way of creeping back when you least expect it. One evening, I was leaving the production studio when my phone buzzed with a notification. I glanced down to see an email from a name I hadn't seen in months, Emma. I stared at the screen for a long moment before opening it. "John, I know this is out of the blue, and I wouldn't be writing if it wasn't important. I've thought about everything that's happened, what I did, how it ended, and I want you to know that I've been doing a lot of reflecting." That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed closure. Real closure. Maybe this conversation, this final talk, would give me the last piece of the puzzle I hadn't realized I was missing. Against my better judgment, I decided to meet her. We agreed to meet at a quiet cafe just outside the city, away from the prying eyes of the media. When I arrived, Emma was already there, sitting at a table near the window. She looked different, tired, worn down by everything that had happened. Her once perfect facade had crumbled, and she was just Emma. I walked over, unsure how to feel. Part of me wanted to turn around and leave, but I didn't. "John," she said softly when she saw me, standing up awkwardly. I nodded in greeting and sat down across from her. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the weight of our shared history filling the silence. I could see the regret in her eyes, the apology she hadn't quite spoken yet. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said finally. Breaking the tension. "Neither was I admitted." She glanced down at her hands, fidgeting with the edge of her napkin. "I don't even know where to start." "Why don't you start with why we're here?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Emma took a deep breath. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since everything. About what I did, and why I did it. I didn't want to face it before, but now, I can't avoid it. I need to take responsibility for what happened." I raised an eyebrow. "So, what is this? A confession? You already admitted it all on air, Emma. There's nothing left to confess." "I know," she said quickly, looking up at me. "I know. But I'm not here to apologize again. I mean, I am, but it's more than that. I want to explain. I owe you that much." I crossed my arms, leaning back in my chair. "All right, go ahead." Emma sighed, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't start the affair with Matt because I didn't love you, John. It wasn't about that. I know that sounds crazy. But it's the truth. It was about control. About feeling like I had something that was mine, that wasn't tied to the show, or the image of us as the perfect couple." Her words hit harder than I expected. I hadn't anticipated an explanation that felt so human, so real. "I was losing myself," she continued. "The pressure of the show, of always being Emma, the perfect co-host, it started to crush me. And instead of talking to you about it, instead of being honest, I did the worst thing I could. I ran to someone else. Someone who wasn't a part of that world." I stayed silent, letting her talk. It was a strange feeling, hearing the truth laid out like this, after all these months of bitterness. "I know it doesn't make it right," she said softly. "And I'm not asking for forgiveness. I needed you to understand that it wasn't because you weren't enough. It was because I wasn't enough. I didn't know how to handle it all. For the first time, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel betrayed. I just felt tired. I don't know what to say, Emma," I admitted, running a hand through my hair. "I've spent so long being angry at you, at everything. I thought getting revenge would make me feel better, but it didn't. It just left me empty." Emma nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I know, and I'm sorry for everything. I really am." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of our words hanging between us. There was no need for more apologies, no need for more explanations. We both knew what had happened, and nothing could change it. "I'm moving forward," I said finally. "I've got a new project, something that's helping me rebuild. I think that's what we both need to do." Emma wiped at her eyes, nodding. "I'm trying. It's been hard, but I'm trying." We stood up together, the conversation ending not with a bang, but with a quiet understanding. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no promises to stay in touch. Just two people who had once shared everything, now walking away with the knowledge that it was truly over. The next few weeks passed in a quiet blur. Meeting Emma had given me the closure I didn't know I needed. It was like a chapter of my life had finally been closed, and I was free to turn the page. The documentary project was picking up steam, and I found myself throwing everything into it. It wasn't just a job, it was a chance to create something real, something meaningful. Every interview, and every story we captured felt like a step toward building a new identity. One that wasn't defined by the chaos of the past. One morning, as I sat in the editing room, reviewing footage from our latest shoot, I received a call from my producer. "John, we've got an opportunity," he said, his voice excited. "There's a festival in New York that's interested in showcasing our series. It's a big deal." For a moment, I was speechless. New York, a festival. This was the kind of recognition we had been hoping for, but I hadn't expected it to come so soon. "That's incredible," I finally managed to say. "When do we leave?" "Next week," he replied. "I'll send you the details. Start packing." As I hung up the phone, a wave of excitement washed over me. This was it, the fresh start I had been working toward. The chance to show the world what I was capable of, on my own terms. That evening, as I stood on my back porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The journey hadn't been easy, but I had come out the other side stronger. Wiser. And most importantly, free. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I was ready to face it. The week flew by in a blur of preparation. I packed my bags, double-checked my tickets, and made arrangements with the team to meet in New York. The festival was bigger than I had anticipated, a major platform for up-and-coming filmmakers and creatives. Our documentary series had been chosen for a special showcase, and while I was excited, there was also a nervous energy buzzing beneath the surface. This was the first time in a long time that I'd be stepping into a public spotlight again, but this time, it was different. It wasn't about drama, scandal, or personal turmoil. It was about the work, the stories we were telling, the people we had met along the way. I wasn't sure how the industry would react to me now, but I wasn't afraid. This was a new chapter, and I was ready. The flight to New York was uneventful, but as soon as we landed, the city's energy hit me like a wave. I'd been here so many times before, press tours, interviews, red carpets, but this visit felt different. This time, I wasn't the host of a glossy morning show. I was here as a storyteller. When I arrived at the hotel, the team was already there, buzzing with excitement. My producer, Jake, gave me a slap on the back as I walked in. "We made it, man," he said, grinning from ear to ear. "This is huge. You ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be," I said with a smirk, trying to keep my nerves in check. The next morning, we headed to the venue, a sprawling theater where our documentary would be shown to an audience of industry professionals, filmmakers, and critics. The thought of it all made my stomach twist, but there was also a sense of exhilaration. The screening room was packed. As we took our seats, I could feel the weight of the moment settling on my shoulders. This wasn't just a job anymore, it was my way of proving to myself, and maybe to the world, that I could rebuild. That I was more than the mistakes of my past. As the lights dimmed and the opening sequence of our documentary flickered onto the screen, I allowed myself to relax. The stories we had captured were powerful, moving, and real. As the film unfolded, I could hear the audience reacting, gasps at the emotional moments, and murmurs of approval as our subjects bared their souls. When the credits rolled, there was a pause, and then the room erupted into applause. Real, genuine applause. My chest tightened with emotion. This was validation, not for my ego, but for the work itself. For all the hard hours we'd put in, for every story that mattered. After the screening, Jake and I were ushered backstage for AQ. The world of morning TV. They weren't here for scandal this time, though. They were here for the art. The first few questions were directed at Jake about production, but then the focus shifted to me. "John, this is such a departure from what we're used to seeing from you," one of the audience members said. "How did it feel to transition from morning show host to documentary filmmaker?" I thought about the question for a moment. It wasn't easy, I admitted. I've spent most of my career in a very different environment, fast-paced, lighthearted, with a focus on entertainment. But after everything that happened, I needed to step back and ask myself what I really wanted to do. I've always been passionate about stories, real stories, and this project gave me a chance to explore that. It's been a challenge, but it's also been one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. The questions kept coming, about the documentary, about the process, about the stories we chose to tell. But not a single one was about Emma, the affair or the scandal that had defined the last year of my life. It was a relief, but more than that, it was a sign that I had finally moved on. After the cue, and I had a lot to be proud of, but there was still a quiet part of me that wondered what was next. Where did I go from here? As I walked, the neon lights of the city reflecting off the wet pavement, I realized something. I didn't need to have all the answers right now. For the first time in a long time, I was content with the uncertainty. I didn't need to plan every step of the way or control every outcome. I was free. When I finally returned to my hotel room, I stood by the window, looking out over the city. The skyline was as bright and chaotic as ever, but for the first time, I wasn't overwhelmed by it. I picked up my phone and opened my messages. There was one from Jake. "Great job today, man. We killed it. Festival organizers want to talk more tomorrow. Big things ahead." I smiled, typing a quick response before setting the phone down. The road ahead was wide open, and I was ready for whatever came next. For the first time in years, I felt whole again. There was no more revenge, no more bitterness. Just me and the future I had rebuilt from the ashes. And that was enough. The next day at the festival, things moved quickly. Meetings with producers, conversations with investors, and talks of future collaborations filled my schedule. It felt like everything was finally falling into place. The documentary had garnered attention, and doors that once seemed closed forever were now wide open. That evening, after a whirlwind of networking and business cards, I found myself at a rooftop party overlooking the city. The air was cool, and the energy was high, but my mind drifted. Despite the success and excitement of the past few days, there was still a small, unspoken part of my life that hadn't been fully dealt with. Emma. I hadn't thought about her much since our final conversation in the cafe. We'd gone our separate ways, and I had moved on. But there was a nagging feeling that, despite the closure I'd gotten from our last meeting, something remained unfinished. I hadn't heard from her since. And part of me was glad. But another part, deep down, wondered what had become of her. As I stood on the rooftop, looking out over the skyline, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I expected it to be Jake or someone from the team, but when I glanced at the screen, my heart skipped a beat. It was a message from Emma. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. After everything that had happened, after all the mess and heartache, did I really want to open this door again? But something in me needed to know what she had to say. I opened the message. "John, I know I shouldn't be reaching out again, especially after everything. But I just wanted to say, I saw the documentary. I watched it online, and I'm so proud of you. You've really found your path, and I'm glad you're doing what you love. I know things between us can never be fixed, and I don't expect them to be. I just wanted you to know that I'm happy you've moved on. I'm trying to do the same." I stared at the message for a long time. It wasn't what I expected. There was no hidden agenda, no plea for reconciliation. Just a quiet acknowledgement of our past and a wish for both of us to move forward. It was simple, and maybe that was all it needed to be. I typed a response. "Thanks, Emma. I appreciate that. I hope you're finding your own peace. Take care." I hit send, feeling a weight lift off my chest. The final words were said, and the last thread between us was quietly severed. There would be no grand reconciliation, no dramatic finale. Just two people who had once shared everything, now walking away on their own paths. As the night went on, I felt a strange sense of freedom. Emma's message, as unexpected as it was, gave me the final bit of closure I didn't realize I still needed. I had been so focused on rebuilding my career, on creating something new, that I hadn't stopped to fully release the past. But now, standing there with the city lights below me, I felt lighter. I stayed on the rooftop for a while longer, watching the world go by, and feeling the breeze on my face. I didn't think about the show, the scandal, or the betrayal. All of that felt like a lifetime ago now, part of a different world I no longer belonged to. As I left the party and made my way back to the hotel, I realized how far I had come. Not just professionally, but personally. The man who had once been consumed by revenge, by bitterness, was gone. In his place was someone who had learned to let go. The festival had been a success, but more than that, it had marked the start of something new. A future not defined by old mistakes or past heartbreaks, but by the choices I was making now. For the first time, I wasn't running from my past. I was walking toward my future, clear-eyed and ready. I stepped into my hotel room, closing the door behind me. As I looked around the quiet space, I realized I was truly alone. But it didn't feel lonely. It felt right. I didn't need anyone's approval, anyone's forgiveness. I was at peace with myself, and that was more than enough. I poured myself a glass of water and sat by the window. Watching the city that had once seemed so overwhelming now feel like home. The noise, the chaos, it didn't scare me anymore. Tomorrow, there will be more meetings, more opportunities, more steps forward. But for tonight, I just let myself be. I wasn't John, the wronged husband, or John, the morning show host. I was just John. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. The next chapter of my life was already beginning, and I was ready to embrace it, without regret. Without looking back. And with that, I finally let the past go.